Hey everybody, welcome back to another very exciting episode of the Photoshop Training Hour. I am your host, Jesus Ramirez. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this episode, we're going to talk about the powerful Select and Mask Workspace, which allows you to remove backgrounds from any photo. Not just backgrounds, in reality, you can mask and cut out anything from a photo using this powerful workspace. This episode is sponsored by our good friends at MSI Computers. By the way, MSI is currently having a sale on Amazon's Prime Day. There's a link in the description. You can check it out. We'll talk more about MSI a little later on, but a lot of laptops are on sale, including the MSI Creator Z16, which, as you know, is the laptop that I'm currently using. Well, why don't we just jump right into it? This is the image that I'm going to work with. We have a background layer and a foreground layer. And the goal is to remove the background from this image so that we can make it seem like those two people are jumping in front of this grassy field. And you can go into Select and choose Select and Mask. This dedicated space will come up, and this has all the tools that you need to select and mask objects in Photoshop. And we're going to talk about most of the tools here and all the sliders so that you understand how they work. First, we have the selection tools right up here. Then we have the navigation tools. The navigation tools are easy. You know how to zoom. You click to zoom, hold Alt on Windows, Option on Mac to zoom out. And if you're zoomed in, you can click on the hand tool to pan, but I like using the space bar instead. You can always double click on the hand tool to fit the image to screen. And the way that I like to start selecting my objects is by using the new object selection tool. Notice that when you enable the object selection tool, there's this icon going around in a circle. That's Photoshop analyzing the image to detect the main subjects. If you tap the N key, the letter N, just like the first letter for the word no, the N key, you can see the main subjects that Photoshop selected. By the way, we're currently in the onion skinning mode at 78%. The default is 50% at onion skinning mode. So this is probably what you will see. And these are the different views. We'll start working with the onion skinning mode and we'll come back to it. But the point is that once you have seen the objects that are selected, you can hover over it, over them, and they'll highlight in blue, indicating that you can select them. If this were a real project, I wouldn't select both of my subjects in the same layer. I like to keep layers separately, so I'll select them individually. So that's what I'll do in this case, but you're more than welcome to select more than one subject at a time. You can click, hold Shift, and click again, and Photoshop will select both subjects. In this case, we'll start with the guy, and we'll just click once to make a selection. When you're in the onion skinning mode, Photoshop will display the selected object at 100% opacity, and everything that wasn't selected at the opacity that you set in the transparency slider, in this case 50%. From here, we can start selecting different views. You can press the F key on the keyboard to select the different views. The one that I like going to next is this one here, the black and white view, that also has the keyboard shortcut as K. And what I like to do is I like to zoom in and look at my edges. And this is very important because to get a good selection, a good cutout, a good mask, you need good edges. And that's what all the sliders here on the right allow you to control. Right here under Global Refinements. Global Refinements gives you the smooth, feather, contrast, and shift edge sliders, which control the edges of the overall image that you're working with, or the selection that you're working with. I should mention that I like a two-step process for making my selections. So I usually disregard the hair or anything else that is not a sharp edge, just because you're just never going to get it right. You need more than one pass if you have different types of edges in your subjects. When you're working with a person, you will have different types of edges, just because most people have hair, and that will be a different edge than, say, their arm or pants or something like that. So what I like to do is get my edges right first and then come back and work on the hair. So what do these sliders do? Well, the smooth slider, as the name suggests, will smoothen the edge. I'm just going to drag it all the way to the right, and you can see how much smoother that is. That obviously loses a lot of the detail that I want. So you have to fine tune this slider so that the edges are smooth, but you don't lose the actual detail in the image. So you're going to have to play with this and fine tune it accordingly. What I like to do next is adjust the contrast. The contrast just creates a sharper edge. It makes brighter pixels brighter, darker pixels darker on the mask. So it just creates a sharper line. Watch what happens when I go all the way to the right. See how sharp that line is? You usually don't want that. So you want something that's not so smooth and not so sharp. Again, fine tune accordingly. The next two sliders, feather and shift edge, I don't use too often. I may do a little bit of a shift edge, which pushes the selection inward a bit. Most recently, I haven't been doing this inside of this workspace. I do it outside of it. I'll show you what I mean by that in a moment, but you can certainly shift the edge in or out if you want to within this workspace. The feather slider allows you to soften the edges. It blurs the edges, which essentially undoes everything we just did. So again, unless it's a specific selection or mask that I'm going for, I rarely use the feather slider, but that's what it does. So once you have something like this that looks pretty good, you can once again tap on the X key. By the way, when you tap on the X key, you can see the actual original image, and you tap on the X key again, it brings you back to the current view that you have. Currently, we have the black and white view, and to cycle to a different view, again, is the F key. And in this case, I'm gonna just press the F key so that we can see the background that we're working with, so that I can see more or less the final result, and I can fine tune my image accordingly. Now it's time to fine tune the edges. And what you want to do at this point is use the brush tool to either add or subtract to the mask. So you can zoom in and see where there's some imperfections, like right here under his ear. So you can just paint in pixels, or if you hold Alt on Windows, Option in the Mac, you can subtract from the selection, and that's what I'm going to do. And I'm just going to hold the space bar and just move around and paint away any imperfections. Just for the sake of time, I'm not going to get every single little detail, but obviously in your projects, do spend a little more time fine-tuning the smaller details. You can also click, hold Shift. Let me do that again. Click, hold Shift, and Photoshop will draw a straight line in between the 2 points. I'm also holding the Alt key as I do that shortcut so that I can subtract from the selection and not add to the selection. And again, just holding Alt and fine-tuning all these smaller imperfections. Again, I'm not going to spend so much time on getting everything right just because of time. Something that I like to do is in areas like this, I don't necessarily like how the sleeve is bending, so I'm just going to mask it out. You don't have to keep every single original pixel if it doesn't work for you. So in this case, I think the image looks much better if I mask that area out. And I think everything is looking fantastic. There's obviously a whole lot of more work to do, but before we get to it, let me look at the chat and see if there are any questions. People from all over the world, Germany, California, Sweden, Boston. I'm sorry, everybody, I can't name everybody who's commenting, but thank you so much. You guys are all amazing. We have Brazil in the house, New Jersey, thank you so much. Scotland, awesome. Cool. Let me see if this is a question. Okay, so yeah, there's a question in the chat that's a little bit more advanced. The question is, when I cut out, this is from Real Lion Productions, when I cut out a headshot and try to place the image in a black background, the hair looks really messed up, like a lot of gray around it. It's a halo. So I knew questions like this were going to come up, so I was ready for them. So I have a video tutorial called Advanced Hair Masking in Photoshop, Mask Hair from Busy Backgrounds. So this is a more advanced video. You can check it out. I'll place the link in the description after the stream, but you could also search for Photoshop Training Channel Advanced Hair Masking, and this is the video here, and I talk about some advanced techniques. If we have time, I'll get a little bit into that in this stream as well. But anyway, thank you for the question. Cool. Greece in here as well. Awesome. Good to see you, everybody. Mark from London. Awesome, Mark. Anyway, so now that I have my selection, at this point, I can now work on the hair. We're going to come back in here. We're going to talk more about some of these other parameters in a moment. But for now, we're just going to make sure that we output to a layer mask. layer mask right here and press OK. Photoshop will then create a layer mask based on the settings that we applied. Now, remember earlier how I mentioned that I didn't like contracting or expanding the mask inside of the Select and Mask Workspace? Well, that's because I think there's a better way of doing that. And one of the ways of doing that is, let me find an area here that has some fringing. I guess a shoe here. It'll be obvious with a shoe. You can go into Filter, Other, and select minimum. Make sure that the layer mask is selected. The focus should be on the layer mask, this white outline. And you can just use the minimum filter to contract the mask. See how I'm just making it smaller? This is way more powerful and more precise than the contract slider. And if you under preserve, if you select roundness, that will give you access to decimal points. So you can do something like 1.5 pixels and you're not stuck with whole numbers. And that gives you even more control. So notice how you can just remove the fringes from images. But actually, there's even a more powerful way. For example, what you can do is you can make a selection just around that specific area, like so, and then run the filter. Filter, Other, Minimum, and you can just apply it to a very specific area. And I think that this is way more powerful than simply using the slider in the Select and Mask Workspace. I wish this minimum and maximum filter was in Select and Mask. Maybe one day Adobe will add that into Photoshop. Now you will create a problem, as you see here. Like, it also contracted this part of the shoe. No problem. With a layer brush, you can paint with white to reveal and black to conceal. So I'll paint with white on my layer mask to reveal that part of the shoe, and I'll use that same keyboard shortcut I told you about a minute ago. I'm going to click once, hold shift, and click again, and in Photoshop will create a straight line in between the two places where I clicked on, and that looks pretty good. And obviously you would repeat this process over and over again. If you make some mistakes like I did here, notice that I didn't remove these pixels from the selection. You can always do that on the mask by painting with black and just taking your time and fine-tuning these smaller details. And again, you can come in here and make a selection like so, and then just run the minimum filter once again. That was probably too much. The first filter is always the last filter that you use. If you just select it, it'll run it again with the previous settings. But if you hold the Alt key on Windows, the Option key on the Mac, and click on minimum, Photoshop will bring up this window where you can reapply the settings. So in this case, maybe we'll do roundness at maybe like 1.5. And that looks pretty good, I would say. And maybe it missed a little bit here, but that's okay. We'll use that same trick of holding shift and painting away. And actually, no, that looks like that's the grass, so that's pretty good. And one of the things that I know that I missed is the shoelaces. I forgot to add that in the Select and Mask Workspace. If you forget to add something like I just did there, you can always paint it back. And you can paint it back by painting with white, but I can't really see where the shoelace is. So there's two ways of looking at the image and then painting on the mask. If you hold shift and click on the mask, you'll see this red X that disables the mask, but I can still paint on it. So I can come in here and paint with white. And when I enable the mask again, you can see that I painted over those areas. The other thing that you can do is you can go into the properties panel and click on this little mask icon and then bring down the density so that you can kind of see what was behind it. This is very similar to the onion skinning mode we were in the Select and Mask Workspace. And I can just come in here and paint in the areas that I missed. And obviously I'm going quickly and I'm not even using my Wacom tablet, but you will see that the results are not going to be too terrible. They're going to be pretty okay. And I'm holding shift and clicking just to paint in those areas. And I can bring in the density back up and the shoelaces are back in the image. So again, that's another technique that you can use to further fine tune the details in Select and Mask or in any layer mask. Really, you don't have to use Select and Mask to create it. When you enable this, click on the layer mask, you can click on Select and Mask, or you can just double click on the mask and it'll bring up Select and Mask. And now we can work on the hair. So what I did now is work globally on all the edges. Now I'm just going to focus on the hair, but I'm not going to use the global refinement sliders because I don't want to make any changes to the actual edges of his body because we already did that. We spent time doing that, so I don't want to ruin it by using these sliders. So I'm not going to use the global refinement sliders anymore. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use this tool right here called the Refine Edge tool. And I'm just going to paint around his hair like so. And what that's doing is Photoshop is applying an edge detection algorithm, trying to remove the foreground from the background, the hair from the background. What does that look like? Well, if you scroll up, you can click on Show Edge right here, Show Edge, or press the J key on the keyboard, and you can see exactly the areas that Photoshop is targeting for that adjustment. The reason that I'm enabling this is because I also want to show you this slider right here called Edge Detection. If I increase the radius, what Photoshop will do is look at the entire edge and apply that same adjustment. You rarely want to do that. Maybe if he was like Chewbacca or something like that, maybe a dog or a cat or something where the entire shape was hair, maybe you would want to do that. But definitely not on a person, because I don't want Photoshop analyzing the other edges. But the point is that when you enable Show Edges, you can clearly see how this is working. Photoshop is now applying a 10 pixel radius on these edges where the background, where Photoshop will analyze the background and foreground and attempt to create separation between them. Notice that when I enable the Smart Radius, Photoshop now, and I'll increase the radius so it's easier to see. So notice that the edges are no longer smooth. They're sort of jagged. So Photoshop is attempting to automatically adjust the width of the slider. Watch when I uncheck this box, the edges are smooth again. See that? Because now it's just applying a 66 pixel analyzation area. And when I click on this, Photoshop tries to determine what that is. So it's not a complete smooth line. I rarely use this feature, so I usually keep it at 0. Like I said, only if I'm working with maybe a dog or a cat. But in those cases, I probably would just use a brush to paint the fur back in. So, it depends. It depends on what you're working. Thank you for the comment, Matt. I'm sorry. Thank you for the comment, Matt. Jesus, happy to see you live. I kind of read that comment in the corner of my eye, and I thought you said happy to see you alive. But yes, happy to see you live. Awesome. And there's a question in the chat from Learning. Can you explain different refine modes? Yes, the refine modes. That's what I was going to talk about next. So very, very good question, right in the perfect time. So refine modes are these two guys right here, these two buttons, and they also relate to the edge detection slider or the stuff that you paint with using the Refine Edge brush tool or the Refine Hair button. All the same thing, really. Right now I have Object Aware selected. Object Aware uses an algorithm that tries to detect differences based on the object, so it's better for things like hair and stuff like that. Color Aware just uses contrast found in the image to try to remove the foreground from the background. It is my understanding that this is the old algorithm and this is a newer one. And this, if you were using Select and Mask prior to the Object Aware algorithm being added, then you would get the same results. This is just the new one that uses, I believe, AI to determine what the object is and try to remove the foreground from the background. And if you hover over the little buttons, you'll see basically what I just explained. Best choice for hair or fur on complex backgrounds. And this one reads, best choice for simple or contrasting backgrounds. So most of the time I have mine set to Object Aware, just because in my testing at least the algorithm seems to work a little bit better, but feel free to switch the algorithms and see which one gives you a better result. Awesome. Cool. Let me see if there's any other questions in the chat. Eric, yes. So Eric is asking a very good question. Asking me about flipping the subjects to make sure that the lighting matches. We'll get into that a little bit later on, but when you're compositing, you have to definitely make sure that the lighting matches the scene so that everything looks realistic. But that is usually after the masking process, depending, well, I shouldn't say that. It really depends on your workflow, right? But that definitely should be done at some point. Anyway, let's continue. So now that we know how the refine modes work, what edge detection does, what do we need to do with this brush? Well, this brush just allows you to tell Photoshop where to fine tune the edges. And if you paint on an area that you don't want, you can always hold Alt and Windows Option in the Mac and subtract. like so. And usually I work without looking at the edge. I just turned on the edge so that you could see it. So when you paint on something, notice that Photoshop attempts to separate the foreground from the background, but this works better on hair. Sometimes highlight on hair can confuse Photoshop. So what I like to do is I just like to remove the pixels from that were selected using the paintbrush. Oops, sorry about that. The paintbrush, and I'm just painting in the highlights that were accidentally removed by the refine edge. Something I kind of touched on for just a moment earlier was the refine hair button. The refine hair button, and I'll enable the show edge. The refine hair button basically attempts to do what I just did automatically. I selected the refine edge brush tool, and I could see where the hair is, so I painted that in. But you can click on refine hair and Photoshop will attempt to do the same thing. Sometimes it works great, sometimes it doesn't. In this case, it added these random elements here. I'm not really sure why, if the person is here, but it also added a little bit of his eyebrow, a little bit of his ear, which will cause issues. So most of the time I just paint it in manually, but you can certainly click on the refine hair button if you like. And once I disable show edge, you can see the result, and it's looking pretty good. Now, I rarely use this feature, but I do want to mention it because it can be very powerful and it can be very useful in some cases. So if you uncheck the contaminate colors, what that will do is apply this amount slider. I usually just leave it set to 100. You'll see what the amount is. It's just basically how much Photoshop is going to paint on the edges of the layer, and you'll see what I mean by that in a moment. I'm going to press OK. And Photoshop now created a copy, this one here, and then it has the original one back here. So there is a difference. Notice that when I click on the eye icon, you can see that this one attempted to fill in some edges using the color that was already found in the image. When I disable the mask by holding Shift and clicking on it, notice that Photoshop actually went in there and painted using the same color that was found on the edge. It painted just a few pixels outside of that. See that? See how the edges just have a color now based on the color of the image? So that's what that option does. And it attempts to remove any of that fringing. I usually don't use it, but if I do use it, I don't use it in this method that Photoshop outputted the layers. Like what I prefer to do. And actually, before I show you that, let me show you the difference. I'll disable the layer mask on both images, and you can see the difference. See that? See how Photoshop just painted in basically a stroke of the same color that is found on the edges? See that? So that's what that option does. See that? You can clearly see here in the hair as well. Photoshop is trying to fix that. So that's what that option does. So the way that I would do it, or the way that I think Photoshop should output it at least, is instead of duplicating the layer and creating a new layer mask, use the same layer and then clip it to the layer below. And then that way you can still use the same mask. It's just a much cleaner way of organizing layers, I think, at least. So you can see the before and the after. See that? See how here Photoshop did a good job actually of removing those edges, and that works much better. Also, in some cases, having that global stroke just doesn't work. So what again, if I were doing this, I would hold Alt and Windows Option in the Mac and click on the layer mask, make everything black, and just paint with white on the layer mask in those areas that are causing issues, and not over the entire image, because not the entire image is causing issues. So only in areas that just don't look right, I can come in here and make sure that I fix those edges, and I think that would give me a better result, as you can see here. And again, I didn't spend a lot of time fine-tuning those edges, so with better edges, we wouldn't have a lot of these issues. And the reason that you want to clip that layer to a layer mask, to a layer below with a layer mask, is you only have to worry about one mask. So if I discover another issue like I did here, I can just paint on one mask and I don't have to worry about doing the same thing to a second mask. So there we go. Just fix that there and fix this issue here, and we have a better mask. And I don't have to do it again on a separate layer mask. Before I continue, let's talk a little bit about our sponsors today. Our sponsors are MSI Computers. MSI is currently having a Prime Day special offer, link in the description. Also, if you're watching this in the future and you already missed the Prime Day, no worries. Make sure that you check out MSI's Summer Deals, and the link is also in the description. Again, the MSI Creator Z16 laptop is the laptop that I was using just a few months ago, and I upgraded to the MSI Creator Z16P, but the Z16 professional laptop is currently on sale on Amazon, so make sure that you check it out. Also, now that we're looking at links, I just posted I rarely update my Behance, but I just updated it yesterday on a project I worked on with HBO. I've never seen the show, so let me know if it's good. I've worked on so many TV shows that I've never seen, but this is one of the latest ones that I worked on. Is Hacks Season 2 poster. I was one of the finishers that worked on this poster. Thank you to BLT Communications, who is the advertising agency that hired me for this project. So pretty cool project that I got to work on, and a lot of things that I learned while working on these projects are the stuff that I teach you guys here on the streams and on the tutorials. And that's I would like to think that that's one of the differences between me and other YouTube creators, that I'm actually a working professional. I just didn't start randomly teaching Photoshop without having any background. I'm still working with different agencies on different projects. I'm currently working on a project with Apple. I've worked with HBO, Netflix, Hulu, so creating all kinds of graphics. And every now and again, I'll think of something while working on a project, and then I'll come and show it to you guys here on the Photoshop training channel. But anyway, so the question in the chat earlier, and I'm sorry, I forgot who asked the question, was, am I going to match the lighting in the scene? And if you look in the background here, the shadows are on the left and the highlights are on the right. What about my subject? The shadows are on the right and the highlight is on the left. So you actually have to switch it. So you can press Control T, Command T to transform and flip horizontally, and now the lighting matches in the scene. Here's a fun fact for you guys. Now that we're talking about all this, in the show Hacks, you will notice that the shadows in the mountains don't match anything else. And that's because that's the way the client wanted it. I wanted to flip it and they said no. So if you see this poster and you're like, wait a minute, why are the shadows on the wrong side? That's because that's the way the client wanted it. And whoever signs the paychecks is in charge. So even in like high-end posters like that, sometimes the person in charge says, nope, we want the mountains the other way, and you have to do it. But anyway. So another thing that I wanted to show you guys is we work with the man, and what I would do at this point is, duplicate the layer, bring the layer outside of the group. You can hold Control and Windows, Command and the Mac to move layers up and down the layer stack. Control and Windows, Command and the Mac, and the bracket key, sorry about that, to move up and down the layer stack. So I'm just gonna place that layer outside of the group, and you would do the same thing. You can just I'll show you a different method. You can do something similar. I'm going to go into the object selection tool, and this is going to be very similar to what you saw in the Select and Mask Workspace. Once Photoshop finishes analyzing the image, I can hover over the image and click on the other person, in this case the lady here, select her. Notice that Photoshop doesn't always do that good of a job. It missed part of her body here. If that happens to you, you can always go into the quick selection tool, click and drag to add the missing area. I added this little triangle here in between her arm and body, so I'll hold Alt on Windows, Option on the Mac, and I can continue fine-tuning as best as I can. And I'm not going to spend too much time because the process is pretty much the same, but there are some differences here. There's a lot of issues that we're going to have to worry about with the shoelaces, but maybe I can fix those after. Maybe I don't have to worry about these from the start, but we'll just work with these as they are. Anyway, so now that I have a selection that's pretty decent, I can now click on the layer mask icon and then go into Select and Mask. And I can pretty much do the same thing. Go into Glover Refinements, add a little bit of smoothing. Note, to be frank with you, at this stage, I rarely go into the black and white because I can pretty much see the results that I'm getting. I just mentioned that you should probably do that so that you can see. And once you train your eye, you probably don't even need to go in there. but I am smoothing it because I know the edges were jagged, so I do smooth it. And I also add contrast, but I usually do it in the onion skinning mode, and that works fine for me. I just showed you the other method, or the other view, so that you could see it in case you didn't know what I was talking about. But anyway, so that looks pretty good, and I'll press OK, and there it is. Then I'm gonna go back in there, and then I'll do the masking, the hair masking with the Refine Edge tool. I can come in here, paint with the hair. Again, I'm not going into those different views because I really don't need them, just because I know what's going on behind the scenes, and I can press OK. And this is the result. Doesn't look too bad at all. What I can do now is from this layer mask here, I can paint with white on areas that need the work, like on the highlights. Remember how I mentioned earlier, the highlights sometimes get confused as part of the background, and you can do that. I have another tutorial, which is the one I referenced earlier, the advanced hair masking techniques, where I created a brush, and that works great, especially with women's hair, just because you're not going to be able to get every strand of hair, and it just becomes too complicated to select everything. So sometimes you just have to paint stuff back in. And what you need to do is you can go into the you can watch that tutorial to see how I created this brush, but I have a hairbrush here. I think it's this one here. Yeah. And all I do is I can create a new layer and I can paint, and see how I made this brush that just has these flyaway hairs. Well, what I usually do is just bring it down. I'm scaling it, making it smaller. And let's see, that might be still too big, so I'll make it a little bit smaller. And I can use the left and right arrows on the key to rotate the brush. See that? And you can also see the angle here in the options bar. So I'm rotating the brush. Hold Alt. When you have the brush active, you can hold Alt and click on a color to select it. Option on the Mac, by the way. And I'm just going to click on that. That looks a little too bright, so maybe I'll go with a darker color. Yeah, and I think that works pretty good. And I can just place that behind her, like so, and then just find like a good spot for it. Maybe, I don't know, maybe something like this. Whatever works. And then I can just hide the contents, and with just a regular brush, I can paint with white and just reveal it where it needs to be. And I can do the same thing on the other side. Create another one, select the same brush, and this time I'll flip it. And you can flip a brush by clicking on this icon and then just clicking on flip X so that the brush is now facing the other side. And I can use the arrow keys, and same thing, you know, maybe just paint a little bit like that. The hair's a little lighter on this side, so I'll change the color and just paint those hair strands in as best as I can. And then I can hide everything once again. And I'm going quickly here, of course, and paint with white to reveal the hair strands. And you know, you can get a much more realistic result by doing so than just simply trying to mask everything. And also, in this case, it's probably not necessary, but in some cases, what you do need to do is select the layer and go into filter, blur, and add just a little bit of a blur, because the brush that I made is really, really sharp, but you can just blur it a little bit to match the hair a little bit better. And again, if you watch that tutorial, again, I'll place it below in the description. You'll see how I created that brush, and I think I might even have a free download. Don't quote me on that, but you'll see how I made that brush. So maybe somebody in the chat saw the tutorial and downloaded the brush. So let me know if I did have a download. If not, I'll maybe make another tutorial on how I made these brushes. This is, again, a powerful tool that I highly recommend that you learn how to use. I use it all the time in my professional work, so it's definitely worth checking out and mastering it. Obviously, this is not everything with masking. As I mentioned in the start of the stream, Select and Mask gets you there 90% of the way. There's always fine tuning. There's always other details that you need to add. So make sure that you spend time on that as well. And by the way, if you enjoy this stream or any of my tutorials, make sure that you click on that like button. It really helps me out with the YouTube algorithm. Thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you again very, very soon. Bye, everybody.